Hello, my Canadian friends. It's good to be here today. I love coming out to Toronto. I've been doing events with the FITC folks for a while now, and I always enjoy coming up here to Canada. It's great. The people are nice. The weather's not terrible, and mostly, it sounds like it's been a little bit rainy the last month or so. That's what I hear. I think the islands are flooded and they're fish and cod. Somebody mentioned something about that while we were having lunch today. So I'm glad to be out here today to share a few thoughts with you about stuff. Gotcha. So for the AV folks, if we give them a round of applause, they've done a great job today. It also gave me a chance to sneak in a roundabout reference from this morning. Claims Ramya. All right, good deal. So we're going to talk about accessibility today. And I want you to before we begin, to take a moment to imagine some things with me. First things first. I want you to imagine that you're driving to a job interview. It happens, the economy's great, folks are moving around. You're feeling a mix of excitement, nervousness, but before you hop out of your car, you give one last check in the mirror to make sure that your hair's good, there's nothing in your teeth, makeup's good, you have no smudges, nothing crazy like that. You open the car door, you climb out, you walk across the parking lot, head to wherever you're going to have your job interview. You kind of jump up the stairs because you're really excited. You don't think twice about it. Right? That's a pretty common occurrence. Now, instead, I want you to imagine that you arrive at a building for your job interview, and you're also feeling excited, nervous, but there's an underlying feeling of anxiety. You exit your automobile, you roll across the parking lot, there's no ramp, right? Your wheelchair can't climb stairs. You immediately feel this insane sense of panic. Because you have an interview and it's not accessible before you actually get in and do your interview. You don't really know what to do. Imagine again that you're in your mid-20s, your vision's great, it's 2020, or better in some cases. You're at your peak physical health. All of the devices that you own are new. You have these nice, crisp, high-resolution displays. You live in a major city, and you just got fiber. It's an amazing world to live in. Instead, I want you to imagine that your vision isn't quite 20/20, just like about 65% of the population. And like 1 in 10, you're also colorblind. And you're also dyslexic. Now, your phone is 3 years old, you can't afford a new one, your data plan caps out at 3 gigs or 1 gig a month at a 3G connection. The internet connection where you live, where you spend most of your time, sometimes doesn't work. When it does work, it's not the fastest, so you struggle getting online sometimes. Now imagine you can't see at all. You use your computer with a screen reader. A mouse is mostly useless to you, so you use your keyboard to navigate around interfaces. Now, if you woke up tomorrow knowing that you would have what some people consider a fairly debilitating disability, and you had the opportunity to build a new internet, what would you do? What would you think about? What would your priorities be? And what problems would you try and solve? Now, when we build things on the internet today, we have to think about things that our own lives don't necessarily require, because someone else's life does. So imagine the frustration of people who use things designed by people who don't take their basic needs into consideration. Now, imagine the frustration of people who use things that you yourself designed and you didn't even think about their basic needs. It can be a little bit dehumanizing to try and use something and not be able to because somebody didn't take your needs into account. So think about the current state of the last website or application or mobile product that you designed, can everybody use it at the same level without being frustrated or without being able to accomplish their tasks? So when we talk about accessibility, those are kind of fairly narrow examples. We tend to lead to something that somebody is blind, we're going to use a screen reader, or somebody has a physical disability, and there needs to be certain levels of access so that they can be accommodated to enter a building or a facility. And accessibility as a concept is much more broad than just those narrow examples that we shared in the beginning. Now, if there's anything that you get out of our time this morning, I want you to remember just one thing, and one thing only, is that accessibility really is all about being inclusive, empowering people, and allowing for independence. Now, accessibility ensures that people aren't excluded, that they don't feel frustrated by the sites and services and things that you design, and it allows them to accomplish various tasks or series of tasks without this feeling of frustration all the time. Now, I think we've all been there. We've all attempted to determine what kinds of people are going to be using our products. Now, you give the names like Jane or John or Sally or Betty or whatever. You know, John is a busy father. He's working a blue-collar job. Jane is a mother of two. She drives a minivan. She takes her kids to soccer practice. Sally's retired. She has to ask her grandchildren for help to use her mobile phone. Silly things like that, right? Those are typically how we envision the folks that use the products that we try and build. And I dare to guess that the majority of cases when we're creating personas, we have an ideal type of human in mind. In most cases, we fail to take into account the wide range of abilities that people have. Now, there are wide ranges of abilities that folks have in regards to their ability to see, their ability to hear. Some people have dyslexia, autism, dementia, stress, access to education. All of these things affect an individual's literacy levels and their memory. Diseases like ALS, age, other conditions affect physical ability and the impact of a person's mobility, dexterity, strength, and level of pain. And sometimes in our own lives, we might experience some sort of temporary disability caused by illness or injury. So I want to spend a few minutes and talk about the idea or concept of making sure that the design and the work that we're doing in the industry is as inclusive as we can make it. So there are a few key things that I want to focus on. One is design really starts with identifying a user's needs, a person's needs. If you don't really know who your users are, what needs they have, you're probably not going to build the right thing. So we do research, we do analysis, we talk to users, and we try to not make assumptions. That's kind of the ideal scenario. We try to have empathy for users, and we should always remember sometimes that they may ask for things that they don't necessarily need. So as a user experience professional, one of our core roles is to really try and understand the users and understand their needs. And that's a very difficult thing to do if we're not focusing on the folks that we're building the software for. Now, too often things are not designed with this perfect user in mind, but keep in mind that folks' abilities range from sight, hearing, there's a full spectrum of in between, that there are common conditions like dyslexia, autism, dementia, stress, physical capabilities. All of those things impact a person's ability to use the things that we're trying to create for them. And it's our job to make sure that we're understanding what we consider to be not the ideal user. So context is also very important. We're not designing just for a screen. I see a lot of laptops in the room today. That there are so many different ways that people can engage and interact with the things that we're trying to build. We need to think really hard about the context of where they're using what we're trying to build. Are they in a library? Are they on a phone? Are they really only familiar with Facebook? Have they even ever used the web before? Now, we probably take that for granted. We have Wi-Fi. It's working today at a conference, which is kind of an odd thing to have happen, but I'm glad it is. But there are many people in very different circumstances that their norm is not our norm. that their internet is not as good, they don't have the newest phone, they may not even have a smartphone. They may use an old Nokia that's going to last for the next 30, 40 years, because that's how they're built, right? So at times we also experience temporary disabilities caused by illness, injury. We experience situational disabilities in that sometimes we can't hear well because we're in a noisy room. Sometimes we can't see well because we're in bright sunlight. Most screens don't handle those situations very well. Audio's not the best sometimes. Driving over here, we had a sprint planning call in the taxi to get to the hotel, and you couldn't hear that well. Like street noise, the audio on the phones. Like Apple says it's pretty good, but it's really not that good. Not at all. Now, there are three principles that I want to focus on, and UK.gov has a really simple way to evaluate accessibility. And I've kind of co-opted that a little bit. So at the most basic level, for something to be accessible, a person needs to be able to complete a task or a series of tasks without being encumbered. It's kind of simple, but kind of not simple. So three principles I want to focus on. One is what we build needs to be perceivable. Now, the information that we provide the human being on the other side of the software that we're trying to build needs to be available. The information that we give them needs to be available to one of their senses. Typically sight, hearing, or touch. I guess you could do taste or smell, but that might be really weird in like a web experience. But if you figure something fun out, maybe don't let me know, but it could be interesting if you come up with something beyond the three tactile type senses. So if information is provided as text, the user needs to be able to see that text, hopefully. If the person has low vision or if the person is blind, they need to be able to hear it. That's typically done through some sort of screen reader. If the person is both deaf and blind, they need to be able to touch it. They need to be able to feel it. That's accommodated typically through touch and happens through electronic braille devices. So text is relatively easy to make accessible because there are methods in which we can allow a person, regardless of their disability, to see, hear, or touch the text that we're providing them. Two is that it needs to be understandable. The information that we give them, they have to be able to understand. It needs to make sense to them. So there are many people that struggle to process and retain the types of things that they're reading. For people that struggle with dyslexia or are on the autistic spectrum or have had some sort of brain injury that impacts their comprehension, the information should be plain and it should aid their comprehension on the things that we're trying to define. We don't really need these wordy, complex, very marketing-focused, jargon-laden copy. It's hard enough for us to understand, but we should make sure that anybody can understand the things that we're trying to describe. Otherwise, we sort of failed in delivering this content to people. And then the third is once that I've perceived what you're giving me and I can understand what you're really trying to convey, then it needs to be operable, meaning that somebody should be able to interact with that information, consume that information in some way. So somebody using a keyboard should be able to do everything that somebody is using a mouse with. So if I'm navigating to a website, I should be able to navigate and use the information there just using the keyboard. So taking into account these three principles allow for a much more robust experience. And it allows people to complete their tasks or series of tasks without feeling encumbered, without feeling frustrated. Now, people have varying levels of sensory, cognitive, and physical abilities. All too often, things are built with this fictional average persona. Someone who has perfect vision and perfect hearing, who uses a mouse or a touchscreen and has good basic literacy. Very few people in reality are like this, especially when you take into account that a person's ability changes based off of the context. Where are they? What are they trying to do? What's their education level? So one of the very first sensory impairments that exist are visual. So I'm colorblind. I'm not really colorblind, but this is an example. I'm colorblind and can't perceive the difference between some colors. I worked when I first started at Cardinal, I worked for a company that was a large insurance brokerage. They purchased insurance companies, and they did a lot of things that insurance companies do. The CEO of the company is colorblind. So you would design things, and I didn't know he was colorblind until I'd been there for about 4 or 5 months. And he would express that he didn't like things, or there wasn't enough pop. And I didn't know why. Like, it looked pretty good to me, but there wasn't enough contrast in the things that we were giving him. But he also did make it really widely known that he was colorblind, and we needed to kind of cater to that a little bit. So it was a little bit roundabout until we realized, oh, he's colorblind. Maybe we should adjust our approach when we're presenting this information to him. I have low vision, and I may need to increase the text size in my browser. Or I have low vision and need to use a screen magnifier to make things bigger, and I can't read text that has poor contrast. My wife and I have a friend down where we live who has low vision issues, but he has an iPad and he reads books, and he has like this big magnifying glass, and that's what he uses to increase the size of the text. So things like that are fairly common. Or I'm blind and I use a screen reader, or maybe I'm deafblind and have to use a Braille device. So those are kind of the levels of vision impairments that exist. Secondary is we have auditory impairments. Now, I either am hard of hearing and I struggle to hear most things, or maybe I'm deaf and sign language is my first language. I may find written English hard to read and write. Because that's not really how I learn, right? I learn using sign language. I may have motor impairments. I have a mild motor impairment, and I struggle to use a mouse with fine control. I'm going to call Envision out for a little bit. Love the product. I think they're a great team. If you don't, you know what Envision is. That they're a prototyping tool. They allowed you to upload images and kind of stitch together screens to build a mostly functional prototype. Now, one of the interactions that they have, and for context, we're a consultancy, so we need to share things with people outside of our network. We're not really adding them to Envision sometimes. But if I'm looking at one of the screens that they give you, most of the controls for sharing and anything like that is hidden under a hover. Which is kind of okay, but kind of not. But when I hover over that, then I get 4 options, and the click target on those options are teeny weeny. I have such a hard time trying to hover over, get it just right, not hover off, click the thing so that I can do what I want to do. Now, if I had even a mild motor impairment and my hand was a little bit shaky, there's no way, unless just sheer luck, that I could hover over and select something with such a tiny click target. I may have a medium motor impairment and I just can't use a mouse. I may have to use a keyboard for everything that I do. Or I could have a severe motor impairment and can't use a mouse or a keyboard, and I have to use some sort of speech recognition to navigate through the web. Maybe I have a speech impediment and struggle to communicate by speech. I'm much more effective and confident when using text-based communication. I had one of my grandparents suffered a series of strokes. Her mind was there. She was sharp as a tack, sarcastic as all get out. But the only way that she could communicate was with a little bitty type terminal. She would use a pencil, and with her good side, she would type in what she wanted to say. And that's how she communicated for 3 or 4 years. So again, things like this aren't rare cases, that they are fairly common. The last one would be cognitive impairments. So I have dyslexia, and I struggle to process written text. Or I'm on the autistic spectrum and have a literal understanding of that text. Maybe I have ADHD, and I have a hard time concentrating on long bodies of text. I might have a learning disability and find it difficult to take things and understand really what the intended meaning is. My memory may not be as good as it used to be. Mine totally isn't. It's not the best. But folks' memory may not be good. They may not have a very good recall. and they might get easily confused. Or in some cases, I might have epilepsy, and seizures can be triggered by flashing content. Sorry if the flashing was a little bit too much. So everything that we build, we need to take into account that not everybody is like us. Most people aren't like us. And we need to make sure that we're building things that are inclusive and legible and readable as possible. If we have to sacrifice elegance, totally okay. Not everything has to be tiny text with light, faint gray borders. That there's so much more to design than just aesthetics. Because we're building for needs and for audiences, not to just make things look pretty. I think making something look pretty is probably the least important thing that we need to be worrying about as we're building software and applications. Accessibility isn't something that's either true or false. It can only be measured in relation to a specific ability or specific scenario. Something that can be accessible to some people while being accessible to others is something that comes up quite often. So some basic guidelines as you're thinking about either an existing application or product that you're building or something that you're planning to build in the future. I'm going to list off 5. There's a lot more to take into account. I'll show a longer list towards the end. One of the, I think the easiest thing to just kind of dip your toes in accessibility water is this idea of color contrast. So on the web, in the digital space, we probably have about 140 plus trillion combinations of colors that we can use. It's a lot of colors. Now, obviously not all these colors combined together are going to be accessible. The contrast isn't going to be quite right. But even if we just took 1% of those colors and assumed that 1% were going to be an accessible color combination, that would give us at least 140 million color combos. Now, I think that's more than enough for us to be able to build designs that look nice and also have the correct contrast ratio. Now, it's more than enough to be pleasing and accessible. Now, the suggested contrast ratio from WCAG is a minimum of 4.5 to 1. There are various tools out there that allow us to check our contrast ratio. If you're kind of developer inclined and you use something like Google as your browser of choice, and you can actually check your color contrast ratio in your dev tools, and it will let you know if the text color has enough contrast to the background and vice versa. There are also standalone tools that exist on Windows and Mac, probably Linux as well. If you're a designer and you use Sketch, there are plugins for Sketch that will also calculate those for you within Sketch. If you're using a preprocessor like SAS or any type of build systems, you also have modules you can plug in that will check your contrast. So there's really no excuse because most of this can be automated now to make sure that your contrast is correct as you're doing this work. 2. Another challenge that I've seen, this is probably more prominent in forms. So when I'm filling out something and the state changes, I've either entered the correct data or the incorrect data. In most cases, people tend to change the border color or the font color or both on the input itself. The defaults tend to be green for good, red for bad, maybe like a weird blue or yellow in there if you needed some in-betweens. The challenge with that is if I'm colorblind, for example, and green is good and red is bad, I can't tell the difference. I have no idea what's wrong because I've only been given one thing to indicate the state. So we need to be able to distinguish information and not just base that on color. Iconography is great. Actual text is even better. Because just because you think that a caution triangle with an exclamation point means that this is correct doesn't mean somebody else is going to assume the same thing. It could be a cultural difference depending on where you're from. So text is always better, almost always better. A combination of all 3, that's probably A-okay. There's nothing wrong with that. 3 is structure and hierarchy. Now, when you're creating a page, you're creating the page structure, your heading levels, your paragraphs, your order list, whatever you want to call those, structuring your page and making that hierarchy visually useful really depends on how the values of your typography relates to each other. So if you're ever looking at a website, especially when using large fonts, and something feels a little bit off to you, it's normally not because the fonts are too big. It's normally because the relationship between the scale of the fonts or font size that are being used isn't correct. Because if you're trying to create a typographic scale, it needs to be a little bit more logarithmic and increase at larger numbers so that it visually looks proportional. So if I'm looking at a website and I'm trying to scan the content, having a much better typographic scales allows me to scan that content much easier, and I can see the values or the chunking together of information based off of heading levels. Visually, that's a very helpful thing. From a semantic level, again, if you're developer friendly, if I'm using a screen reader, the tag that I use on those headings, on that content, is immensely important because in a screen reader, I have various ways that I can choose to navigate that content. One of those ways is navigating through headings. If everything's in H1, then I have no hierarchy and have no idea how to navigate this page. So your markup as well needs to scale appropriately. So if a second thing that I think is interesting is if you've ever participated in usability studies, particularly with somebody that may have some type of vision impairment, not necessarily blind, especially if the text is too small, one of the first things people will do in those studies is they'll bump up the text size. It happens so often. You go into a study, you look at somebody, they sit down, and oh, I can't read this. They bump up the text size. Now, it feels like the inverse should probably be what happens because there really aren't as many issues using a larger font size because if it's too big for me, I can bump it down. But most of us have a hard time reading text that's too small, and we bump it up. I find myself doing that a lot. Another thing, smaller font sizes, lighter font weights, not the best. 4, labels and forms. Now, there are varying trends that have kind of cropped up over the last couple of years on how we're handling forms. So the relationship between labels and the actual inputs. What kind of took hold is that our labels are now part of the inputs, and there's a faint gray text over the label, and when I give the field focus, the label either goes away, or like if you're material design, the label kind of animates up and kind of goes above. Or in some cases, you just don't have any labels and just have some form fields with basic placeholder text or placeholder attribute on the input itself. And it just goes away completely. And then there's still kind of the old school that exists where the label's either on top or to the left, hopefully not to the right if you're in a Latin-based language. So the challenge with that is visually there is a relationship between the labels and the inputs, and that structure needs to be fairly concise. If I'm looking at a small form, it's a little bit less of a problem, but it compounds as the form gets larger and larger and larger. Now, if I'm using a screen reader and there are 15, 20 elements on the page that are specific around forms and there are no labels, I have no idea what you're asking me to put into those forms, and I can't complete that task. Even for a sighted user, somebody that can visually see what you're building, and I've done this before where there are 4 or 5 fields and it's a placeholder label, and I tab in and put in some content, and I tab somewhere else, put in some content, and then I kind of forget where I am in the form and what they're asking for, so I have to delete what I put in there so I can see the placeholder and then put the right stuff back in. So don't do that. That's bad. 5, the last one is focus indicators. Now, making a website accessible relies really heavily on the intent of focus. So if I'm using a keyboard and I'm trying to tab through a website, and I can't actually see what I'm selecting as I tab, I'm going to have a very hard time navigating. Now, as an experiment, you can go to your favorite website or your company's website and try and use it with just your keyboard, tabbing through and hitting enter, and see how easy it is for you. Like, you know what's going on, you can see everything, it's great, hopefully. Most of them are pretty bad. So the intent of unstyling focus, what front-end dev started to do is there's an attribute you can put in your HTML that allows you to set the actual look and feel of what happens when you focus on an element. By default, for whatever reason, I guess because it didn't look nice, they set that to have no visual appearance at all. It was a noble idea. I kind of get the intent. And if you ever do that, just make sure you replace it with something else that visibly shows where I'm tabbing through the site. Because the problem is that most websites don't create their own focus styles. The focus indicators are fundamental to the success of keyboard users. And it's largely absent on most of the websites that we see. So just make sure you provide your own focus states. Whenever I'm doing a hover, I tack on a focus as well, so they're about the same. Now, to kind of wrap up a little bit, there is a guideline that's an official spec called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, lovingly called WCAG, and we're at 2.0. WCAG has 3 levels that define how accessibility should work. Now, if you work for a government agency or even a financial institution, in most cases, you're legally obligated to conform to the spec at certain levels. Most government agencies and banks try and conform to at least level 2. Getting to level 3 is a bit of a challenge, but it's totally doable. And these are some of the things that are required just at level A, like the baseline things that you're responsible for if you're trying to make things accessible. So making sure that you have alt text on images and things like that, any imagery, any graphs, charts that describe what you're doing. Things like your focus state, input state, error identification. Within HTML, there are role attributes that you can put on your HTML elements that make it easier for a screen reader to read what you're, to understand what you put together. Level AA looks kind of like this. If you have video, you have captions. Specifically, if it's live, you have an audio description for something that's pre-recorded. You can resize text and images. There are headings and labels. Focus is visible. You're doing a good job on error prevention. And then level 3 has a whole bunch more stuff, specifically around visual presentation, reading level, making sure that a large majority of the population can understand what you're trying to do. You're eliminating interruptions. Who designed a modal window or an interstitial like in the last month? Not as many as I thought. Good for y'all. Shame on the rest of you. No. One of the most annoying things sometimes is when you come to a website and you're trying to accomplish a task. Big old honkin' modal. Subscribe to our newsletter. Or whatever. Those things are interruptive, and if you're trying to complete a task, it's a huge pain. Now, if I've made that accessible and I see that in a screen reader, those can be difficult to close sometimes and actually get to the task that I was trying to do, because then I have to close it and then go through a hierarchy again. It's a bad day for those folks. Now, you might be asking yourself at this point, how am I going to convince my boss to give me the time and budget to do all of this stuff and do it well? And I think my question would be, why would you ask? Because it's kind of part of your job. Whether you're a designer or a developer, it's your job to make software that people can use. And part of that job is making it accessible. From a coding perspective, from a design perspective, it should be kind of the natural order of how you approach solving design solutions. Now, to kind of wrap up, accessibility really isn't just about checklists and specs. It's about building inclusive solutions, empowering people, and allowing for independence. because it creates an environment that people don't feel excluded and frustrated from using something that's really just been poorly thought out, and they can accomplish what they've set out to do. The goal, I think, in the end, is to make things as inclusive as we possibly can, to try and exclude no one. Now, this can be done by trying to make sure that there aren't any barriers that make it impossible or difficult for anyone to use what we build, because in the end, I think we want things to be used by everyone. Now, that's all I have. You can find me online. There are very few Bermon painters in the world. I know one, he's my father, but he's not really on the internet that much. So I do open office hours every Friday morning from 7 to 9 a.m. Eastern Time. If you ever want to chat about accessibility, user experience, SaaS logos, whatever, this is all online. They're 10-minute sessions. I try and keep those fairly concise. When the timer's up, the conversation's done. So it just keeps us kind of on task. You can also find me on Twitter or Skype or email as Bermon Painter. If you want to lengthy your conversation, just hit me up on one of those places and we can chat a bit longer. Thanks again for FITC. It's been a great day. That's all I have. Question. Let me do the first one first. My memory's terrible, and by the time I answer the first, I'll have forgotten the second question. I'm like a goldfish, I think, sometimes. So her question was, she's had to learn most of this on her own, like reading through the spec, reading blog posts, I imagine. Are there any resources or training or anything like that to kind of get folks up to speed? Like, what does good accessibility look like? I guess what you're getting at. There's not a lot out there, frankly. There are some decent blog posts, but they're pretty high level. Smashing Magazine actually just released a book, like a decent accessibility book, that the whole intent behind the book is to talk about accessible design patterns. It's a pretty good book, good read. I would probably start there. I believe there's a couple of O'Reilly books around accessibility that they go a good bit deeper in what you're trying to do. If you shoot me like a note or something on Twitter or whatever, I can send you links to those. Second question.
So our client is level A certified. I'm looking at level AAA, but there is one little thing there to change the request that seems really difficult to achieve. Do you have examples of websites that are level AAA?
There are so few sites that I'm aware of that are level 3 certified. Which one? Yeah, like the actual spec site is. One would hope they fulfill their own criteria. If not, maybe something's off somewhere. It would be nice if they had like a list of sites that were AAA certified, so you kind of peruse through and kind of see what's going on. I haven't run across any in a really long time that go that deep. My best guess would be a government organization somewhere, but I'm not sure how you would find that out other than trying to run it through some type of, is this AAA or not?
So what if you have a website like a photography website or something that's very visual oriented? Is there a business case to make that accessible for visually impaired and blind? And if there is one, how do you make that business case?
So I'm going to answer your question with a question, I guess. Is it important for the business for unsighted people to see and understand the photography? If it's not, shame on them, because it should be. And to make something like that accessible doesn't require a lot of effort. So the business case is, do they actually care about the folks using the site? They're not going to know every single person that's coming to the site. As far as making it accessible, because it's very image heavy, there are really a couple sides that come to mind. One would be a lot of imagery requires a pretty good copywriter. I probably would want to try and write copy that describes the photography that you've taken. A good copywriter would be able to describe the scene and pinpoint some of the metadata. So who took the picture, where was it taken, what was the time of year, was it hot, was it cold, and add a little bit of flourish to kind of tell a story around the image. Depending on if you're doing carousels or slideshows or something like that, probably a bad idea if that's the case. You can make those accessible, but even for a human, like carousels and sliders and things like that, it's kind of a pain to work with. So there are visual functionality things that you can do to make it accessible to folks that aren't using a screen reader, and then if you're doing anything that requires JavaScript for functionality as you're navigating through pictures, you have to use ARIA essentially, which is an HTML5 spec around accessibility, to make sure that all that stuff is tagged appropriately so that I can use it if I'm not using a mouse.
Right. Thank you.
All right, that's all we have. I'll be around if you want to chat more. We'll chat later.